That's the author of Maus. In the historical evolution of a certain field, autonomy requires a distinction between large-scale production and small-scale production. Just an ideal sketch of how Bourdieu made it, it's only the ideal sketch. On the mass market, the demand for profit dominates everything. On the market of the small-scale production, the demand for innovations is crucial. Therefore, it can be called a symbolic market. In the 1980s, when Art Spiegelman brought together American, Japanese, and European comics artists in his avant-garde journal Raw, just an example for one of his editions, Cherry Moriarty explained in an interview, quote, "We all worked for nothing because Art Spiegelman made no money after production costs. The point wasn't the money or the career, but a desire to see your work published in the best possible way," unquote. This indicates the existence of two different markets. Like in this sketch you can see right autonomy, left the autonomy and right the large-scale production. The predomination of symbolic over economic demand in the symbolic market gives rise to the specific rules of their times of success. For the comic avant-garde, and this applies to any other avant-garde as well, there is a more or less long time span between the creation of the work and its success. For example, Art Spiegelman had been publishing Maus in his journal Raw since 1980, but the success did not set in before 1987. Within the symbolic market, immediate success is a very rare phenomenon. While Will Eisner, in contract with God, had been disapproved by the mass market for a long time, it was first published by independent editors, and only 20 years later by a major company. However, the two markets are not divided by a static frontier. It would be a misunderstanding. During the first half of the 20th century, there was obviously no clear distinction between the two. Nevertheless, it is possible to discern whether there are positions inclined towards cultural autonomy or towards profit. Important is the relation between the positions according to the antagonism of economic and symbolic value. Also, Winsor McKay's Little Nemo and George Herman's Crazy Cat, two examples, among others, were appreciated as aesthetically innovative comics. Both artists depended on syndicates, like so many of their colleagues prior to 1960. But McKay, as well as Herriman, should be regarded rather as individual cases than representatives of a symbolic market. By contrast, the comic author Robert Williams, who in the 1980s contributed to Cramp's magazine Zap, that can be seen as a first step of the comics production towards a small-scale production, explained, quote, "When I got to meet Zap artists, for the first time in my life, I had run across spirits who went through the same thing I did. They could draw, but were denied any standing in art schools," unquote. His words confirm that the network characteristic of American underground comics has to be regarded as a symbolic market beyond the legitimate institutions. But how does the distinction of two markets determine aesthetic strategies? I can give only a few examples here, of course, in abstract. Very often, the early comics avant-garde in the 1960s used an arte povera style. That's one of the examples. Black and white, no exact perspectives, and drawings reminiscent of raw wood-cut prints were deployed in order to distinguish oneself from the pleasing forms of the mass market. Robert Crumb, for instance, criticized the fact that the animated film of his character Fritz the Cat was in color. According to Crumb, the coloring destroyed the dress style of his cartoons. Autonomy does not simply mean freedom. Although the autonomous pole of the comics field is able to cut back the influence of economic demands, it also establishes a symbolic force. To be in the field is to distinguish oneself from others by means of symbolic production. Every new avant-garde generation is therefore forced to distinguish itself not only from the mass market, but from the more former avant-garde generation as well. Although Crumb, the representative of the first generation of the American comics avant-garde, attacked the mass market with shocking cartoons, Art Spiegelman, a representative of the second generation, refused to do this in his comics. His late comics, of course. He avoided Crumb's subjective empathy by focusing on the narrative structure and reinvented the cool description for this Holocaust comic Mouse. His achievement in regard to pictorial narratives, in other words, his program of cool authorship, can truly be called a reinvention, because it has been a characteristic for modern narrative since Gustave Flaubert invented the social novel. By the way, Flaubert strictly refused the addition of illustrations to novels. Chris Ware, who may stand in for the third generation, added the color and the linear style to the cool description and also to distinguish himself from Spiegelman. So that's very abstract, it's more complicated than that. Since the 1960s, there have been 3 generations of comic authors in the symbolic market, at least in the US and in France. They have been able to reproduce their knowledge about the innovations of comics production continuously. This uninterrupted evolution has been accompanied, of course, by specialized critics, by magazines such as the Comics Journal in the US, Cahiers du Bande Dessinée in France, or by publishers such as French Futuropolis, which first re-edited Tracy Cat. The more autonomous a field of symbolic production is, the more it can exclude persons without a specific expertise. This is a historical fact which leads us finally to the third social difficulty to overcome. In the US and in France, the distinction between the above-mentioned 2 markets of comics production did not exist until the 1960s. During the first half of the 20th century, the wisdom of the pioneers of independent comics was distributed only in an oral way. However, it was rediscovered in the 1960s when the symbolic market emerged, and in the 1970s, critics generated a historical sense for the elaborated works of independent comics. To Art Spiegelman, for example, the elaborated comics of the early 20th century, such as works of Lionel Feininger, laid the foundations for the independent comics of the second half of the 20th century. On closer inspection, his view can be described as an aesthetic strategy to select elements for a complex language of comics from the field's history. Seen from a sociological standpoint, there is no continuous series of elaborated comics from the beginning to the end of the 20th century. An artist's subjective reference to the field's history is necessarily different from a researcher's objective account. However, field sociology can describe a strategy such as Spiegelman's to construct a continuity of elaborated comics through the 20th century as an effect of a break with the social conditions to produce comics for a mass market. A semiotic analysis without sociological objectivation sees only the symbolic similarity and therefore the continuity between the first pioneers of elaborated comics and the authors of independent comics in our time. But in order to understand comics as a dynamic field, it is necessary to consider social strategies as constitutive elements for symbolic forms. Therefore, the construction of historical continuity is a strategy of the symbolic market to elaborate new symbolic forms requiring a new legitimacy of comics. Thank you.